Chapter 18 of The Evil Shepherd by Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was one of those faultless June evenings when the only mission of the faintly stirring breeze seemed to be to carry perfumes from garden to garden, and to make the lightest of music amongst the rustling leaves. The dinner table had been set out of doors, underneath the odorous cedar tree. Above, the sky was an arc of the deepest blue, through which the web of stars had scarcely yet found its way. Every now and then came the sound of the splash of oars from the river, more rarely still the murmur of light voices as a punt passed up the stream. The little party at the sanctuary sat over their coffee and liqueurs long enough after the fall of the first twilight, till the points of their cigarettes glowed like little specks of fire through the enveloping darkness. Conversation had been from the first curiously desultory, edited in a way, Francis felt, for his benefit. There was an atmosphere about his host and Lady Cynthia, shared in a negative way by Margaret Hilditch, which baffled Francis. It seemed to establish more than a lack of sympathy, to suggest even a life lived upon a different plane. Yet every now and then their references to everyday happenings were trite enough. Sir Timothy had assailed the recent craze for drugs, a diatribe to which Lady Cynthia had listened in silence for reasons which Francis could surmise. If one must soothe the senses, Sir Timothy declared, for the purpose of forgetting a distasteful or painful present, I cannot see why the average mind does not turn to the contemplation of beauty in some shape or other. A night like tonight is surely sedative enough. Watch these lights, drink in these perfumes, listen to the fall and flow of the water long enough, and you would arrive at precisely the same mental inertia as though you had taken a dose of cocaine, with far less harmful an aftermath. Lady Cynthia shrugged her shoulders. Cocaine is in one's dressing room, she objected, and beauty is hard to seek in Grosvenor Square. The common mistake of all men, Sir Timothy continued, and women too, for the matter of that, is that we will persist in formulating doctrines for other people. Every man or woman is an entity of humanity, with a separate heaven and a separate hell. No two people can breathe the same air in the same way, or see the same picture with the same eyes. Lady Cynthia rose to her feet and shook out the folds of her diaphanous gown, daring alike in its shapelessness and scantiness. She lit a cigarette and laid her hand upon Sir Timothy's arm. "Come," she said, "must I remind you of your promise? You are to show me the stables at the walled house before it is dark." "You would see them better in the morning," he reminded her, rising with some reluctance to his feet. "Perhaps," she answered, "but I have a fancy to see them now." Sir Timothy looked back at the table. "Margaret," he said, "will you look after Mr. Ledsam for a little time?" "You will excuse us, Ledsam. We shall not be gone long." They moved away together towards the shrubbery and the door in the wall behind. Francis resumed his seat. "Are you not also curious to penetrate the mysteries behind the wall, Mr. Ledsam?" Margaret asked. "Not so curious but that I would much prefer to remain here," he answered. "With me?" "With you." She knocked the ash from her cigarette. She was looking directly at him, and he fancied there was a gleam of curiosity in her beautiful eyes. There was certainly a little more abandon about her attitude. She was leaning back in a corner of her high-backed chair, and her gown, although it lacked the daring of Lady Cynthia's, seemed to rest about her like a cloud of blue-grey smoke. "What a curious meal," she murmured. "Can you solve a puzzle for me, Mr. Ledsam?" "I would do anything for you that I could," he answered. "Tell me, then, why my father asked you here tonight. I can understand his bringing you to the opera. That was just a whim of the moment." but an invitation down here savours of deliberation. Studiously polite though you are to one another, one is conscious all the time of the hostility beneath the surface." "I think that so far as your father is concerned, it is part of his peculiar disposition," Francis replied. "You remember he once said that he was tired of entertaining his friends, that there was more pleasure in having an enemy at the board." "Are you an enemy, Mr. Ledsam?" she asked curiously. He rose a little abruptly to his feet, ignoring her question. There were servants hovering in the background. "Will you walk with me in the gardens?" he begged. "Or may I take you upon the river?" She rose to her feet. For a moment she seemed to hesitate. "The river, I think," she decided. "Will you wait for 3 minutes while I get a wrap? You will find some punts moored to the landing stage there in the stream. I like the very largest and most comfortable." Francis strolled to the edge of the stream and made his choice of punts. Soon a servant appeared with his arms full of cushions, and a moment or two later Margaret herself, wrapped in an ermine cloak. She smiled a little deprecatingly as she picked her way across the lawn. "Don't laugh at me for being such a chilly mortal, please," she enjoined, "and don't be afraid that I am going to propose a long expedition. I want to go to a little backwater in the next stream." She settled herself in the stern, and they glided down the narrow thoroughfare. The rose bushes from the garden almost lapped the water as they passed. Behind, the long, low cottage, the deserted dinner table, the smooth lawn with its beds of scarlet geraniums and drooping lilac shrubs in the background, seemed like a scene from fairyland, to attain a perfection of detail unreal, almost theatrical. "To the right when you reach the river, please," she directed. "You will find there is scarcely any current. We turn up the next stream." There was something almost mysterious, a little impressive, about the broad expanse of river into which they presently turned. Opposite were woods, and then a sloping lawn. From a house, hidden in the distance, they heard the sound of a woman singing. They even caught the murmurs of applause as she concluded. Then there was silence, only the soft gurgling of the water cloven by the punt pole. They glided past the front of the great unlit house, past another strip of woodland, and then up a narrow stream. "To the left here," she directed, "and then stop." They bumped against the bank. The little backwater into which they had turned seemed to terminate in a bed of lilies, whose faint fragrance almost enveloped them. The trees on either side made a little arch of darkness. "Please ship your pole and listen," Margaret said dreamily. "Make yourself as comfortable as you can. There are plenty of cushions behind you. This is where I come for silence." Francis obeyed her orders without remark. For a few moments speech seemed impossible. The darkness was so intense that although he was acutely conscious of her presence there, only a few feet away, nothing but the barest outline of her form was visible. The silence which she had brought him to seek was all around them. There was just the faintest splash of water from the spot where the stream and the river met, the distant barking of a dog, the occasional croaking of a frog from somewhere in the midst of the bed of lilies. Otherwise, the silence and the darkness were like a shroud. Francis leaned forward in his place. His hands, which gripped the sides of the punt, were hot. The serenity of the night mocked him. "So this is your paradise," he said, a little hoarsely. She made no answer. Her silence seemed to him more thrilling than words. He leaned forward. His hands fell upon the soft fur which encompassed her. They rested there. Still she did not speak. He tightened his grasp, moved further forward, the passion surging through his veins, his breath almost failing him. He was so near now that he heard her breathing, saw her face, as pale as ever. Her lips were a little parted, Her eyes looked out, as if it seemed to him, half in fear, half in hope. He bent lower still. She neither shrank away nor invited him. "Dear," he whispered. Her arm stole from underneath the cloak, her fingers rested upon his shoulders. He scarcely knew whether it was a caress or whether she was holding him from her. In any case it was too late. With a little sob of passion his lips were pressed to hers. Even as she closed her eyes the scent of the lilies seemed to intoxicate him. He was back in his place without conscious movement. His pulses were quivering, the passion singing in his blood, the joy of her faint caress living proudly in his memory. It had been the moment of his life, and yet even now he felt sick at heart with fears, with the torment of her passiveness. She had lain there in his arms. He had felt the thrill of her body. Some quaint inspiration had told him that she had sought for joy in that moment and had not wholly failed. Yet his anxiety was tumultuous, overwhelming. Then she spoke, and his heart leaped again. Her voice was more natural. It was not a voice which he had ever heard before. "Give me a cigarette, please, and I want to go back." He leaned over her again, struck a match with trembling fingers, and gave her the cigarette. She smiled at him very faintly. "Please go back now," she begged. "Smoke yourself. Take me home slowly and say nothing." He obeyed, but his knees were shaking when he stood up. Slowly, a foot at a time, they passed from the mesh of the lilies out into the broad stream. Almost as they did so, the yellow rim of the moon came up over the low hills. As they turned into their own stream, the light was strong enough for him to see her face. She lay there like a ghost, her eyes half closed, the only touch of color in the shining strands of her beautiful hair. She roused herself a little as they swung around. He paused, leaning upon the pole. "You are not angry?" he asked. "No, I am not angry," she answered. "Why should I be? But I cannot talk to you about it tonight." They glided to the edge of the landing stage. A servant appeared and secured the punt. "Is Sir Timothy back yet?" Margaret inquired. "Not yet, madam." She turned to Francis. "Please go and have a whisky and soda in the smoking room," she said, pointing to the open French windows. "I am going to my favourite seat. You will find me just across the bridge there." He hesitated, filled with a passionate disinclination to leave her side even for a moment. She seemed to understand, but she pointed once more to the room. "I should like very much," she added, "to be alone for 5 minutes. If you will come and find me then, please." Francis stepped through the French windows into the smoking room, where all the paraphernalia for satisfying thirst were set out upon the sideboard. He helped himself to a whisky and soda and drank it absently, with his eyes fixed upon the clock. In 5 minutes he stepped once more back into the gardens, soft and brilliant now in the moonlight. As he did so, he heard the click of the gate in the wall, and footsteps. His host, with Lady Cynthia upon his arm, came into sight and crossed the lawn towards him. Francis, filled though his mind was with other thoughts, paused for a moment and glanced towards them curiously. Lady Cynthia seemed for a moment to have lost all her weariness. Her eyes were very bright. She walked with a new spring in her movements. Even her voice, as she addressed Francis, seemed altered. "Sir Timothy has been showing me some of the wonders of his villa. Do you call it a villa or a palace?" she asked. "It is certainly not a palace," Sir Timothy protested, "and I fear it scarcely has the atmosphere of a villa. It is an attempt to combine certain ideas of my own with the requirements of modern entertainment. Come and have a drink with us, Ledsman." "I have just had one," Francis replied. "Mrs. Hilditch is in the rose garden, and I am on my way to join her." He passed on, and the two moved towards the open French windows. He crossed the rustic bridge that led into the flower garden, turned down the pergola, and came to a sudden standstill before the seat which Margaret had indicated. It was empty, but in the corner lay the long stalked lily which she had picked in the backwater. He stood there for a moment transfixed. There were other seats and chairs in the garden, but he knew before he started his search that it was in vain. She had gone. The flower, drooping a little now, though the stalk was still wet with the moisture of the river, seemed to him like her farewell. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Evil Shepherd by Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Francis was surprised when he descended for breakfast the next morning to find the table laid for only one. The butler, who was waiting, handed him the daily papers and wheeled the electric heater to his side. "Is no one else breakfasting?" Francis asked. "Sir Timothy and Mrs. Hilditch are always served in their rooms, sir. Her ladyship is taking her coffee upstairs." Francis ate his breakfast, glanced through the Times, lit a cigarette, and went round to the garage for his car. The butler met him as he drove up before the porch. "Sir Timothy begs you to excuse him this morning, sir," he announced. "His secretary has arrived from town with a very large correspondence, which they are now engaged upon." "And Mrs. Hilditch?" Francis ventured. "I have not seen her maid this morning, sir," the man replied, "but Mrs. Hilditch never rises before midday. Sir Timothy hopes that you slept well, sir, and would like you to sign the visitors' book." Francis signed his name mechanically, and was turning away when Lady Cynthia called to him from the stairs. She was dressed for travelling and followed by a maid, carrying her dressing case. "Will you take me up to town, Mr. Ledsam?" she asked. "Delighted," he answered. Their dressing cases were strapped together behind, and Lady Cynthia sank into the cushions by his side. They drove away from the house, Francis with a backward glance of regret. The striped sunblinds had been lowered over all the windows. Thrushes and blackbirds were twittering on the lawn. The air was sweet with the perfume of flowers. A boatman was busy with the boats. Out beyond, through the trees, the river wound its placid way. "Quite a little paradise," Lady Cynthia murmured. "Delightful," her companion assented. "I suppose great wealth has its obligations. But why any human being should rear such a structure as what he calls his Borghese villa, when he has a charming place like that to live in, I can't imagine." Her silence was significant, almost purposeful. She unwound the veil from her motoring turban, took it off altogether, and attached it to the cushions of the car with a hatpin. "There," she said, leaning back, "you can now gaze upon a horrible example to the young women of to day. You can see the ravages which late hours, innumerable cocktails, a thirst for excitement, a contempt of the simple pleasures of life, have worked upon my once comely features. I was quite good looking, you know, in the days you first knew me." "You were the most beautiful debutante of your season," he agreed. "What do you think of me now?" she asked. She met his gaze without flinching. Her face was unnaturally thin, with disfiguring hollows underneath her cheekbones. Her lips lacked colour, even her eyes were lustreless. Her hair seemed to lack brilliancy. Only her silken eyebrows remained unimpaired, and a certain charm of expression which nothing seemed able to destroy. "You look tired," he said. "Be honest, my dear man," she rejoined dryly. "I am a physical wreck, dependent upon cosmetics for the looks which I am still clever enough to palm off on the uninitiated." "Why don't you lead a quieter life?" he asked. "A month or so in the country would put you all right." She laughed a little hardly. Then for a moment she looked at him appraisingly. "I was going to speak to you of nerves," she said, "but how would you ever understand? You look as though you had not a nerve in your body. I can't think how you manage it, living in London. I suppose you do exercises and take care of what you eat and drink." "I do nothing of the sort," he assured her indignantly. "I eat and drink whatever I fancy. I have always had a direct object in life, my work, and I believe that has kept me fit and well. Nerve troubles come as a rule, I think, from the underused brain." "I must have been born with a butterfly disposition," she said. "I am quite sure that mine comes because I find it so hard to be amused. I am sure I am almost enterprising. I try whatever comes along, but nothing satisfies me." "Why not try being in love with one of these men who've been in love with you all their lives?" She laughed bitterly. "The men who have cared for me and have been worth caring about," she said, "gave me up years ago. I mocked at them when they were in earnest, scoffed at sentiment, and told them frankly that when I married it would only be to find a refuge for broader life. The right sort wouldn't have anything to say to me after that, and I do not blame them. And here is the torture of it. I can't stand the wrong sort near me, physically I mean. Mind, I believe I am attracted towards people with criminal tastes and propensities. I believe that is what first led me towards Sir Timothy. Every taste I ever had in life seems to have become besmirched. I am all the time full of craving to do horrible things, but all the same I can't bear to be touched. That's the torment of it. I wonder if you can understand." "I think I can," he answered. "Your trouble lies in having the wrong friends and in lack of self discipline. If you were my sister, I'd take you away for a fortnight and put you on the road to being cured." "Then I wish I were your sister," she sighed. "Don't think I'm unsympathetic," he went on, "because I'm not. Wait till we get into the main road here and I'll try and explain." They were passing along a country lane, so narrow that its twigs from the hedges, wreathed here and there in wild roses, brushed almost against their cheeks. On their left was the sound of a reaping machine and the perfume of new mown hay. The sun was growing stronger at every moment. A transitory gleam of pleasure softened her face. "It is ages since I smelt honeysuckle," she confessed, "except in a perfumer's shop. I was wondering what it reminded me of." "That," he said, as they turned out into the broad main road, with its long vista of telegraph poles, "is because you have been neglecting the real for the sham, flowers themselves for their artificially distilled perfume. What I was going to try and put into words without sounding too priggish, Lady Cynthia," he went on, "is this. It is just you people who are cursed with a restless brain who are in the most dangerous position nowadays. The things which keep us healthy and normal physically, games, farces, dinner parties of young people, fresh air and exercise, are the very things which after a time fail to satisfy the person with imagination. You want more out of life, always the something you don't understand, the something beyond. And so you keep on trying new things, and for every new thing you try, you drop an old one. Isn't it something like that?" "I suppose it is," she admitted wearily. "Drugs take the place of wholesome wine," he went on, warming to his subject. "The hideous fascination of flirting with the uncouth or the impossible, some way or another, stimulates a passion which simple means have ceased to gratify. You seek for the unusual in every way, in food, in the substitution of absinthe for your harmless Martini, of cocaine for your stimulating champagne. There's a horrible wave of all this sort of thing going on to day in many places, and I am afraid," he concluded, that a great many of our very nicest young women are caught up in it." "Guilty," she confessed. "Now cure me." "I could point out the promised land, but how could I lead you to it?" he answered. "You don't like me well enough," she sighed. "I like you better than you believe," he assured her, slackening his speed a little. "We have met, I suppose, a dozen times in our life. I have danced with you here and there, talked nonsense once, I remember, at a musical reception." "I tried to flirt with you then," she interrupted. He nodded. "I was in the midst of a great case," he said, "and everything that happened to me outside it was swept out of my mind day by day. What I was going to say is that I have always liked you, from the moment when your mother first presented me to you at your first dance." "I wish you had told me so," she murmured. "It wouldn't have made any difference," he declared. "I wasn't in a position to think of a duke's daughter in those days. I don't suppose I am now." "Try," she begged hopefully. He smiled back at her. The reawakening of her sense of humour was something. "Too late," he regretted. "During the last month or so the thing has come to me which we all look forward to, only I don't think fate has treated me kindly. I have always loved normal ways and normal people, and the woman I care for is different." "Tell me about her," she insisted. "You will be very surprised when I tell you her name," he said. "It is Margaret Hilditch." She looked at him for a moment in blank astonishment. "Heavens!" she exclaimed. "Oliver Hilditch's wife?" "I can't help that," he declared a little doggedly. "She had a miserable time, I know. She was married to a scamp. I'm not quite sure that her father isn't as bad a one. Those things don't make any difference." "They wouldn't with you," she said softly. "Tell me, did you say anything to her last night?" "I did," he replied. "I began when we were out alone together. She gave me no encouragement to speak of, but at any rate she knows." Lady Cynthia leaned a little forward in her place. "Do you know where she is now?" He was a little startled. "Down at the cottage, I suppose. The butler told me that she never rose before midday." Then for once the butler was mistaken, his companion told him. "Margaret Hilditch left at 6 o'clock this morning. I saw her, in travelling clothes, get into the car and drive away." "She left the cottage this morning before us?" Francis repeated, amazed. "I can assure you that she did," Lady Cynthia insisted. "I never sleep amongst my other peculiarities," she went on bitterly, "and I was lying on a couch by the side of the open window when the car came for her. She stopped it at the bend of the avenue, so that it shouldn't wake us up, I suppose. I saw her get in and drive away." Francis was silent for several moments. Lady Cynthia watched him curiously. "At any rate," she observed, "in whatever mood she went away this morning, you have evidently succeeded in doing what I have never seen any one else do, breaking through her indifference. I shouldn't have thought that anything short of an earthquake would have stirred Margaret these days." "These days?" he repeated quickly. "How long have you known her?" "We were at school together for a short time," she told him. "It was while her father was in South America. Margaret was a very different person in those days." "However was she induced to marry a person like Oliver Hilditch?" Francis speculated. His companion shrugged her shoulders. "Who knows?" she answered indifferently. "Are you going to drop me?" "Wherever you like." "Take me on to Grosvenor Square, if you will then," she begged, "and deposit me at the ancestral mansion. I am really rather annoyed about Margaret," she went on, rearranging her veil. "I had begun to have hopes that you might have revived my taste for normal things." "If I had had the slightest intimation," he murmured. "It would have made no difference," she interrupted dolefully. "Now I come to think of it, the Margaret whom I used to know, and there must be plenty of her left yet, is just the right type of woman for you." They drew up outside the house in Grosvenor Square. Lady Cynthia held out her hand. "Come and see me one afternoon, will you?" she invited. "I'd like to very much," he replied. She lingered on the steps and waved her hand to him, a graceful, somewhat insolent gesture. "All the same, I think I shall do my best to make you forget Margaret," she called out. "Thanks for the lift up. Au revoir." Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Evil Shepherd by Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Francis drove direct from Grosvenor Square to his chambers in the Temple, and found Shopland, his friend from Scotland Yard, awaiting his arrival. "Any news?" Francis inquired. "Nothing definite, I am sorry to say," was the other's reluctant admission. Francis hung up his hat, threw himself into his easy chair, and lit a cigarette. "The lad's brother is one of my oldest friends, Shopland," he said. "He is naturally in a state of great distress." The detective scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I said nothing definite just now, sir," he observed. "As a rule I never mention suspicions, but with you it is a different matter. I haven't discovered the slightest trace of Mr. Reginald Wilmore, or the slightest reason for his disappearance. He seems to have been a well conducted young gentleman, a little extravagant perhaps, but able to pay his way, and with nothing whatever against him. Nothing whatever, that is to say, except one almost insignificant thing." "And that?" "A slight tendency towards bad company, sir. I have heard of his being about with one or two whom we are keeping our eye upon." "Bobby Fairfax's lot by any chance?" Shopland nodded. "He was with Jacks and Miss Daisy Hyslop a night or two before he disappeared. I am not sure that a young man named Morris wasn't of the party too." "What do you make of that lot?" Francis asked curiously. "Are they gamesters, dope fiends, or simply vicious?" The detective was silent. He was gazing intently at his rather square toed shoes. "There are rumours, sir," he said presently, "of things going on in the West End which want looking into very badly indeed. You will remember speaking to me of Sir Timothy Brast?" "I remember quite well," Francis acknowledged. "I've nothing to go on," the other continued. "I am working almost on your own lines, Mr. Ledsam, groping in the dark to find a clue, as it were. But I am beginning to have ideas about Sir Timothy Brast, just ideas." "As for instance?" "Well, he stands on rather queer terms with some of his acquaintances, sir. Now you saw, down at Soto's bar, the night we arrested Mr. Fairfax, that not one of those young men there spoke to Sir Timothy as though they were acquainted, nor he to them. Yet I happened to find out that every one of them, including Mr. Fairfax himself, was present at a party Sir Timothy Brast gave at his house down the river a week or two before." "I'm afraid there isn't much in that," Francis declared. "Sir Timothy has the name of being an eccentric person everywhere, especially in this respect. He never notices acquaintances. I heard, only the other day, that while he was wonderfully hospitable and charming to all his guests, he never remembers them outside his house." Shopland nodded. "A convenient eccentricity," he remarked a little dryly. "I have heard the same thing myself. You spent the night at his country cottage, did you not, Mr. Ledsam? Did he offer to show you over the walled house?" "How the dickens did you know I was down there?" Francis demanded with some surprise. "I was just thinking as I drove up that I hadn't left my address either here or at Clarges Street." "Next time you visit Sir Timothy," the detective observed, "I should advise you to do so. I knew you were there, Mr. Ledsam, because I was in the neighbourhood myself.
I have been doing a little fishing and keeping my eye on that wonderful estate of Sir Timothy's." Francis was interested. "Shopland," he said, "I believe that our intelligences, such as they are akin." "What do you suspect Sir Timothy of?" the detective asked bluntly. "I suspect him of nothing," Francis replied. "He is simply, to my mind, an incomprehensible, somewhat sinister figure, who might be capable of anything. He may have very excellent qualities which he contrives to conceal, or he may be an arch criminal. His personality absolutely puzzles me." There was a knock at the door, and Angrave appeared. Apparently he had forgotten Shopland's presence, for he ushered in another visitor. "Sir Timothy Brast to see you, sir," he announced. The moment was one of trial to every one. Admirably borne, Shopland remained in his chair, with only a casual glance at the newcomer. Francis rose to his feet, with a half stifled expression of anger at the clumsiness of his clerk. Sir Timothy, well shaven and groomed, attired in a perfectly fitting suit of grey flannel, nodded to Francis in friendly fashion, and laid his Homburg hat upon the table with the air of a familiar. "My dear Ledsam," he said, "I do hope that you will excuse this early call. I can only have been an hour behind you on the road. I dare say you can guess what I have come to see you about. Can we have a word together?" "Certainly," was the ready reply. "You remember my friend Shopland, Sir Timothy? It was Mr. Shopland who arrested young Fairfax that night at Soto's." "I remember him perfectly," Sir Timothy declared. "I fancied, directly I entered, that your face was familiar," he added, turning to Shopland. "I'm rather ashamed of myself about that night. My little outburst must have sounded almost ridiculous to you two. To tell the truth, I quite failed at that time to give Mr. Ledsam credit for gifts which I have since discovered him to possess." "Mr. Shopland and I are now discussing another matter," Francis went on, pushing a box of cigarettes towards Sir Timothy, who was leaning against the table in an easy attitude. "Don't go, Shopland, for a minute. We were consulting together about the disappearance of a young man, Reggie Wilmore, the brother of a friend of mine, Andrew Wilmore, the novelist." "Disappearance?" Sir Timothy repeated as he lit a cigarette. "That is rather a vague term." "The young man has been missing from home for over a week," Francis said, "and left no trace whatever of his whereabouts. He was not in financial trouble. He does not seem to have been entangled with any young woman. He had not quarrelled with his people, and he seems to have been on the best of terms with the principal at the house of business where he was employed. His disappearance, therefore, is, to say the least of it, mysterious." Sir Timothy assented gravely. "The lack of motive to which you allude," he pointed out, "makes the case interesting. Still, one must remember that London is certainly the city of modern mysteries. If a new Arabian Nights were written, it might well be about London. I dare say Mr. Shopland will agree with me," he continued, turning courteously towards the detective, "that disappearances of this sort are not nearly so uncommon as the uninitiated would believe. For one that is reported in the papers, there are half a dozen which are not. Your late Chief Commissioner, by the by," he added meditatively, "once a very intimate friend of mine, was my informant." "Where do you suppose they disappeared to?" Francis enquired. "Who can tell?" was the speculative reply. "For an adventurous youth there are 1,000 doors which lead to romance. Besides, the lives of none of us are quite so simple as they seem. Even youth has its secret chapters. This young man, for instance, might be on his way to Australia, happy in the knowledge that he has escaped from some murky chapter of life which will now never be known. He may write to his friends, giving them a hint, the whole thing will blow over." "There may be cases such as you suggest, Sir Timothy," the detective said quietly. "Our investigations so far as regards the young man in question, however, do not point that way." Sir Timothy turned over his cigarette to look at the name of the maker. "Excellent tobacco," he murmured. "By the by, what did you say the young man's name was?" "Reginald Wilmore," Francis told him. "A good name," Sir Timothy murmured. "I am sure I wish you both every good fortune in your quest. Would it be too much to ask you now, Mr. Ledsam, for that single minute alone?" "By no means," Francis answered. "I will wait in the office if I may," Shopland suggested, rising to his feet. "I want to have another word with you before I go." "My business with Mr. Ledsam is of a family nature," Sir Timothy said apologetically, as Shopland passed out. "I will not keep him for more than a moment." Shopland closed the door behind him. Sir Timothy waited until he heard his departing footsteps. Then he turned back to Francis. "Mr. Ledsam," he said, "I have come to ask you if you know anything of my daughter's whereabouts." "Nothing whatever," Francis replied. "I was on the point of ringing you up to ask you the same question." "Did she tell you that she was leaving The Sanctuary?" "She gave me not the slightest intimation of it," Francis assured his questioner. "In fact, she invited me to meet her in the rose garden last night. When I arrived there she was gone. I have heard nothing from her since." "You spent the evening with her?" "To my great content." "What happened between you?" "Nothing happened. I took the opportunity, however, of letting your daughter understand the nature of my feelings for her." "Dear me! May I ask what they are?" "I will translate them into facts," Francis replied. "I wish your daughter to become my wife." "You amaze me!" Sir Timothy exclaimed, with the old mocking smile at his lips. "How can you possibly contemplate association with the daughter of a man whom you suspect and distrust as you do me?" "If I suspect or distrust you, it is your own fault," Francis reminded him. "You have declared yourself to be a criminal and a friend of criminals. I am inclined to believe that you have spoken the truth. I care for that fact just as little as I care for the fact that you are a millionaire, or that Margaret has been married to a murderer. I intend her to become my wife." "Did you encourage her to leave me?" "I did not. I had not the slightest idea that she had left The Sanctuary until Lady Cynthia told me half way to London this morning." Sir Timothy was silent for several moments. "Have you any idea in your own mind," he persisted, "as to where she has gone, and for what purpose?" "Not the slightest in the world," Francis declared. "I am just as anxious to hear from her and to know where she is as you seem to be." Sir Timothy sighed. "I am disappointed," he admitted. "I had hoped to obtain some information from you. I must try in another direction." "Since you are here, Sir Timothy," Francis said, as his visitor prepared to depart, "may I ask you whether you have any objection to my marrying your daughter?" Sir Timothy frowned. "The question places me in a somewhat difficult position," he replied coldly. "In a certain sense I have a liking for you. You are not quite the ingenuous nincompoop I took you for on the night of our first meeting. On the other hand, you have prejudices against me. My harmless confession of sympathy with criminals and their ways seems to have stirred up a cloud of suspicion in your mind. You even employ a detective to show the world what a fool he can look, sitting in a punt attempting to fish with one eye on the supposed abode of crime." "I have nothing whatever to do with the details of Shopland's investigation," Francis protested. "He is in search of Reggie Wilmore." "Does he think I have secret dungeons in my new abode?" Sir Timothy demanded, "or oubliettes in which I keep and starve brainless youths for some nameless purpose? Be reasonable, Mr. Ledsam. what the devil benefit could accrue to me from abducting or imprisoning or in any way laying my criminal hand upon this young man." "None whatever that we have been able to discover as yet," Francis admitted. "A leaning towards melodrama, admirable in its way, needs the leaven of a well balanced discretion and a sense of humour," Sir Timothy observed. "The latter quality is as a rule singularly absent amongst the myrmidons of Scotland Yard. I do not think that Mr. Shopland will catch even fish in the neighbourhood of the walled house. As regards your matrimonial proposal, let us waive that until my daughter returns." "As you will," Francis agreed. "I will be frank to this extent. At any rate, if I can persuade your daughter to marry me, your consent will not affect the matter." "I can leave Margaret a matter of £2,000,000, Sir Timothy said pensively. "I have enough money to support my wife myself," Francis observed. "Utopian but foolish," Sir Timothy declared. "All the same, Mr. Ledsam, let me tell you this. You have a curious attraction for me. When I was asked why I had invited you to The Sanctuary last night, I frankly could not answer the question. I didn't know. I don't know. Your dislike of me doesn't seem to affect the question. I was glad to have you there last night. It pleases me to hear you talk, to hear your views of things. I feel that I shall have to be very careful, Mr. Ledsam, or "Or what?" Francis demanded. "Or I shall even welcome the idea of having you for a son in law," Sir Timothy concluded reluctantly. "Make my excuses to Mr. Shopland. Au revoir." Shopland came in as the door closed behind the departing visitor. He listened to all Francis had to say without comment. "If the walled house," he said at last, "is so carefully guarded that Sir Timothy has been informed of my watching the place and has been made aware of my mild questionings, it must be because there is something to conceal. I may or may not be on the track of Mr. Reginald Wilmore, but," the detective concluded, "of one thing I am becoming convinced. The walled house will pay for watching." CHAPter 21